97 this morning, the Student Success Act. Very pleased to sign that into law. And third, just have to make a comment about what's happening in states across the country, particularly Alabama. It's absolutely outrageous what is happening in this country. They are taking political action that criminalizes a medical procedure, criminalizes women's health care and medical providers, and literally driving women into poverty. It is absolutely unacceptable, and it's horrible. It's horrifying that it's being used to score political points.
Well, along those lines, some of the anti-abortion people have basically said they want to push a Roe versus Wade suit because they think the federal judges now are in place to get to the Supreme Court.
Am I concerned about the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of its ability to overturn Roe versus Wade? Absolutely. Do I think the Alabama case will do it? Absolutely not. Wrong approach.
Is there anything you're looking to do in Oregon to cement Roe versus Wade?
We have the most progressive women's reproductive health policy in the country. We passed the Women's Reproductive Health Equity Act last legislative session. I think it is the most comprehensive legislation, and I think it is model legislation for the country.
Could you share?
Governor.
Sure. Who's on the phone?
Justify signing that massive
Lars.
corporate tax when voters just rejected it 30 months ago at the polls.
I'm sorry?
The voters said no to a massive new corporate tax just 30 months ago at the Oregon polls. How do you justify signing this huge new gross receipts tax and the damage it's going to do to business and to jobs in the state?
Well, I would just say this is a very different proposal than ballot measure 97. It's a dedicated investment in early childhood education and K through 12 schools focused on reducing class size, making sure that our schools have the behavioral health supports that they need, and making sure that we fully implement ballot measure 98, the career and technical education measure. In terms of the size of the tax, it's frankly quite different than the proposal that was in a ballot measure 97. And frankly, it was a compromise that we worked on with the Oregon business community.
You're saying the money is dedicated, so if voters don't see a reduction in class sizes, then that promise will have been broken.
Well, not necessarily. Each school district can develop their own plan. As you might be aware, different school districts have different needs. I'll just say, for example, the Enterprise School District probably doesn't need a reduction in class sizes, but they may need behavioral health supports and other tools to ensure that all of their students succeed. The school districts will be developing their own plans, and I expect voters in those districts to hold their districts accountable.
Governor, what about the deal?
Next,
$1 billion will simply go into PERS and to previously working teachers who aren't even in the classroom anymore.
That's actually a really good question, because House Bill 3427 dedicates it to education. I believe that none of it will go into PERS.
What about the deal you had to make to get the Republicans back to get that vote? Aren't you endangering people's health by letting the vaxxers off?
I absolutely believe that Oregon needs tougher vaccination laws. But I came in here this session, I outlined a handful of priorities. And one of those top priorities was making sure that we invested in our education system. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to invest in our education system, something that we haven't been able to accomplish in multiple decades, and that was a top priority for me this session.
Why did you have to make a deal at all? I mean, you guys have a super majority. You could have just waited till Republicans got tired, have a special session, drag it on, and this eventually would have gotten passed.
We could have done that.
Why didn't you?
Because you think the Republicans would have just come back on their own accord? I don't think so. I was really focused on having an orderly session. I think it's critically important that we get done the stuff that we had agreed to do. And I think It is much better to have Senate Republicans working in a collaborative manner to finish the business of the legislature. Again, I was very focused. Who's that?
Involved making promises on two bills, the gun bill and the vax bill. Representative Sarah Gelser was already talking this week.
Does anybody else have a question?
I would just like to know, I mean, how did those conversations start? Last week, we heard from Jenny Burdick, who said, you know, this dies over my dead body. It seemed like on Monday, talking to them, they had a very different take than they did a few days before. And I haven't heard from you kind of how this whole thing worked.
Well, I talk with Republican leaders and legislators all the time. I continued to have conversations with members of the Senate on both parties all last week. I had a sense of urgency. I think the Senate president did as well, that it was critically important that we get this measure, House Bill 3427, across the Senate floor sooner rather than later. Could we have passed it in July? Maybe. I think given sort of the changing financial situation, that would have been pretty impossible.
Do you plan to look at these bills going forward, or these proposals?
Both Senate Bill 978 and House Bill 3063 are dead for this legislative session. I think you all know that I am very committed to moving forward on firearm safety measures. I expect and I am hopeful that House Bill 2013 will be on my desk for signature over the next few weeks. And we will continue to work on how we can strengthen Oregon's vaccination regulations. I think it is a public health issue, and I think we need to get that done.
Governor, why did you overrule the ODFW director on the federal wolf delisting issue? And is there any friction internally because of the differing positions?
We have a disagreement in philosophy, and my position is that it was critically important that we maintain range-wide recovery for wolves across the entire western United States, and I think it's critical that they maintain their listing status in order for that to happen. Oregon has had great success in 1/3 of our state. We've seen a consistent 10 or 11% increase in wolves. That's why we delisted 2 years ago. But I am not in agreement with them being delisted at the national level.
Before Melcher staked out a position and wrote to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, should he have cleared that with your office?
That probably would have been a good idea.
Would you support a partial delisting for just Oregon, like how they did with that Eastern Oregon deal?
It depends upon what the scenario looks like. What's different about this, about both this species and Oregon's work, is that we've been, frankly, quite successful in increasing wolves in the eastern part of the state. The challenge is it's not like wolves pay attention to statewide boundaries, and so this is really needs a regional strategy and a range-wide recovery plan.
Noting that California opposed delisting in Washington State at just the same time that Melcher wrote his letter, said they were fine with federal delisting across the lower 48. Do you see that the western states are not in sync on responding to the feds on this?
I think California is on the same page we are. I think that makes sense given sort of the travel patterns we've seen from wolves. Washington goes their own route. I think that's okay.
Governor, can you give us an update on the Child Welfare Oversight Board? Have you made any progress?
Absolutely. We had our second oversight board meeting yesterday. I met with the crisis management team this week. The oversight board approved the new DHS public records systems policy that will be implemented over the next month and a half. And so I'm very pleased to see that immediate progress. It's a centralized approach to public records, and it ensures that records will be released in a timely manner. that it required the purchase of new software, which they were able to do in a very efficient manner because of the executive order. So that's just a really straightforward example of a system change that we're going to see in a very short time frame.
And was timely defined, or?
Yes, I expect to be fully implemented by the end of June. So.
Okay.
The other piece is met with the crisis management team today. We're focused on a couple of issues, capacity, workforce, and communications. Obviously, I just talked about the public records piece. Capacity looks like, how do we develop the capacity in Oregon to ensure that children with specialized needs can get their support and services that they need in state? Workforce looks like, how do we hire more caseworkers and retain those caseworkers? What does that look like? And I anticipate we'll have timelines for both of those in 2 weeks.
Can you take us back to this weekend? I feel that just like on both sides, Democratic and Republican leaders have been very tight-lipped about why guns and vaccines were targeted. Did Baird Sugar come to you? How did you become involved in this legislative deal?
I was having conversations with both Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats from the moment of the walkout until the walkout concluded. I'm continuing to have conversations with Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans. In terms of why these particular issues, I think that's a really good question for the Senate Republicans. I think my focus, as I said before, was we really needed to prioritize the key issues that I wanted to accomplish this legislative session. And that included making a significant investment in our education system, working to create what I'm calling a seamless system of education from cradle to career.
And can we talk about this extra revenue? Is this something that you would actually want to dedicate to higher education?
So there are two pieces. One, there's the kicker. That's a $1.4 billion rebate to Oregon taxpayers. And then there's the uptick in the ending balance. My understanding, it's roughly $800 million. I haven't seen the Tri-Chair's budgets yet, but I have some key investments that I think need to be made. For example, restoring our Oregon State Police, making sure that we keep tuition down at our community colleges and our universities below 5% increase, and of course investing in our foster care system. So for example, we're pulling out our budget. We anticipate that investing in a surge of caseworkers will require additional resources. Going to be having those conversations with the Tri-Chairs and frankly the co-chairs of the Human Services Committee over the next 48 hours.
What should the state do with this $1.4 billion kicker?
Are you going to support keeping part or all of the new kicker, the biggest kicker in state history? This was in the Constitution and put there by the voters. How can you justify keeping any of that money?
Well, I think that's a conversation for the legislature. As you know, it requires a super majority vote. It's 20 votes in the House and, 20 votes in the Senate and 40 votes in the House. I think it would be very useful to have the conversation about using some of those resources. For example, giving everyone who makes under a certain amount of money their complete kicker, and capturing the rest to pay down our PERS unfunded actuarial liability. Go ahead. I'm sorry. You had a question.
I just want a point of clarification. When you talked about how those two bills got put on, was that the Senate Republicans, those were their offer, or did you operate down?
I think there were a number of bills that were on the list. I think these were two that folks could come to agreement about. In terms of the kicker conversation, would I support if the legislature were able to get the votes? I think it's a really important conversation for us to have, that the issue of whether a portion of the kicker goes to pay down the PERS unfunded actuarial liability. I think that's a really valuable conversation for Oregonians.
But with all due respect, Governor, you didn't say which way you'd go on that. I mean, voters have several times said, we want the money, we don't trust the politicians.
I absolutely, I believe that that is a really valuable conversation to have. And for example, if the legislature were to come up with a package that a portion of the kicker were to be dedicated to the PERS unfunded actuarial liability, I would support that. I think that is good fiscal sense.
Just really quickly, you said
Hey,
key investments in OS.
there's somebody talking that's really soft and I can't hear their voice. Hello?
We need to put it on speaker, Governor. Here we go.
Hello? I'll come back. Go ahead.
Well, just really quickly.
Yeah, now we can hear you again.
Okay, sorry.
Lost you for a couple minutes there.
Oh, sorry.
Do you have a question, Hillary?
I know at this time, I just wanted to continue being able to hear.
That's really important, Hillary. I think what you missed is Pat Doris asked if I would be supportive of a concept that would retain a portion of the kicker to pay down the PERS unfunded actuarial liability. And the answer is yes. I think it's good fiscal responsibility.
Just a quick point on that. You said foster care system, OSP. That money, when you're talking about making investments from there, then are you not talking about the kicker? You're
I am
talking
not talking about the
surplus revenue.
kicker, surplus
Okay.
revenue.
And
Thank
then
you.
on
Good
top
for
of that,
clarification.
House Speaker Kotek did release a plan this morning talking about investments in infrastructure, the Abernathy Bridge. Is that something that you support?
Look, I think it's really important that if we are going to retain a portion of the kicker, that it benefits the entire state, and paying down our PERS unfunded actuarial liability does that.
So the investments in Abernathy Bridge and other, you do not see that as something that benefits the entire state?
I think it has to be a solution that the entire state supports and benefits from.
I have a question in regards to the PERS,
That's Jeff Mapes.
surplus being spent on PERS. Governor, do you support, leaving the kicker aside for a moment, do you support using any of the increased ending balance to help pay down the PERS debt?
Absolutely. I had some in my budget. I had a $100 million pay down in my budget. I think that also makes very good fiscal sense.
Governor, Kaylee's law passed unanimously in the House. You said before that you plan on signing it. Is that still the way it is? Do you have any?
Absolutely.
When you'll do it?
I just think Kaylee's family did an extraordinary job turning what I think is just horrible, horrible pain into a positive change for our universities and community colleges. And I want to applaud them for their work on this bill. And yes, I will be signing the legislation.
Do you know when you might be doing that?
Don't, but we can get you that information. Okay.
Going off of the idea of signing legislation, time frame for that, Senator Boquist said on the floor today, sort of alluded to maybe that you sign 24 or 34, 27 before floor session again, so you couldn't attempt to recall it. Is that true?
We wanted to make sure there were no shenanigans being played on this particular piece of legislation.
Okay, and so my understanding was that you were supposed to have a live signing on Monday, and that was done. It would say you sent it today for that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
To your point
Governor
about
Hillary, and I
advocacy,
do have a question on using some of the kicker. I mean, I'm really curious where you would draw the line on income level that people should still receive their kicker, and then second, are you actually working on a bill or know of anyone who's working on a bill to divert some of that to the UAL? I mean, I know that there was Kathleen Taylor's Rep. Power bill earlier this session, but I think that was I guess that was maybe 700 million only, so is that what you're thinking of?
I think, Hillary, there's a number of ways to do it. You could return up to the first $1,000 for everyone on their kicker. That would roughly consider 85% of the population and retain, these are really rough numbers, 500 million roughly to pay down the PERS UAL. To my knowledge, there's no specific legislation being drafted, other than the speakers, obviously.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
yeah, to your point on advocacy, obviously, the opponents of 3063 were very, very mobilized. I saw them in the building just about every day. I'm sure What role did that advocacy on their part play in deciding to back off that bill this session?
I would say minimal to nothing.
Can you say, in this deal, have Republicans agreed not to walk out again? And have they agreed to suspend the rules and not read bills in full?
I will just say that I think it is unlikely that Senate Republicans and frankly House Republicans will leave and not provide a quorum this legislative session. Look, you asked a question about could they have walked and stayed away forever? Probably, yes. Our tools are fairly limited. I didn't feel like using our limited Oregon State police officers was a good use of their time and energy, and I'm really committed to having an orderly session and getting our priorities done.
If they did, would those bills come back?
I will just say there are consequences.
It is kind of interesting that you were the person who presented the plan to the Senate Democratic Caucus. Senate President sort of has a reputation for being a good negotiator and a good relationship with the Republicans. Why were you the person that was presenting that plan, and where did you get involved in what point did you get?
Like I said, I'd been having conversations with Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats all last week. I felt strongly that I needed to meet with the Senate Democratic Caucus and explain my thinking and my sense of urgency about the passage of House Bill 3427, and wanted to do that on Monday morning.
So you did it on your own? President Courtney didn't ask you to come into the caucus?
No.
You just felt?
Yes, I felt very strongly that I needed to do that. I knew this was not going to be an easy conversation, right? These are difficult conversations. What's different is this is 6 or 7 weeks before the end of session. We're used to having these difficult conversations 48 hours before the gavel falls.
Governor, what's the punch list from here on out to the end of session?
Did you say punch list?
Yes. What are you trying to get done between now and then?
Oh, the checkoff list. So obviously, we are still committed to moving forward on the PERS legislation, Senate Bill 1049. I expect to see that on my desk within the next 2 weeks. House Bill 2020 will be moving shortly. The -84 amendments address a huge number of the concerns that are out there. So I'm not saying it's final. I anticipate you'll see some tweaks, but I'm cautiously optimistic we can get that done as well. I'm still going to continue to fight for our tobacco tax. I think it is the right policy in terms of public health and sustained funding for the Oregon Health Plan. I won't pick on any particular newspapers, but certainly we got criticized for a narrow base of funding for the Oregon Health Plan and a 2-year plan. Without the cigarette tax, we're back at that narrow plan and 2-year funding strategy. So I think it's really important that we move forward on that this session.
I know the newsroom's an editorial.
I will just say editorial boards then is a better qualification, but I don't think it was, I got criticized from your newspaper's editorial board, yes, but I don't know if it was particularly on that issue or not, so.
Governor, this regarding the 3063, obviously there's been a measles outbreak across the country this year. Do you see the possibility of bringing back a vaccine bill specifically targeting measles this session?
This session? I think you're going to have to get broad bipartisan support to make that happen.
Do you think 3063 had the votes in the Senate to pass, or is that one of the reasons maybe it was given up?
Don't know the answer to that question.
And does this agreement apply to the 2020 session with the same group of lawmakers?
No. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Governor.
Good to see you.